Penn Jillette, Penn and Teller. Big guy does magic, smaller guy next to me, he does magic too. He doesn't talk that much. Anyway, I wanted to welcome you to In Time. Welcome you all to In Time with Nick. Love you all. Peace. Go get him, Nick.
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter. Today we have a really special show. Now, those of you who have been following us for a while, you know that I am an atheist. I'm also an anti-theist, and I have a bit of a different approach, but I nonetheless identify as an anti-theist. So do most of the people who work here or who have worked here at any given time. And that does inform the show. This is not an atheist show per se. We cover a lot of topics, and anything that's educational and interesting, we cover. And I think we try to think outside the box in terms of what we bring our audience. But today's show is something that, in my view, is something special, and we've been wanting to do for a very long time. As an anti-theist, I hear a lot about the infallibility of the Bible, and I hear a lot about, it's the Word of God and inerrant Word of God, and there are many takes on it, as everybody knows. But about 2 years ago, I think I'd been talking with Jim Majors. It may have been someone else. I don't unfortunately entirely remember. But I've been interested in counter-apologetics, and somebody recommended to me a video, and I said this is probably the single best video on Daniel that is out there. And so I said, well, I'll check it out. And I heard that Daniel, maybe was a fraud and maybe wasn't. I said, oh, that doesn't sound right. I mean, the book's been in there for a while and I haven't heard about this. And I go and I saw the video, and I thought it was amazing. And I thought it was a spectacular video and very educational. Now, Daniel was a noble Jew who had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians as a teen in 1605 BC. Now, the book of Daniel is written entirely, or mostly, in the first person. And so Christians tend to say, well, okay, he wrote it himself, and roughly in the 6th century BC. However, most scholars actually think that the book was written closer to about 170 BCE. Now, that would be quite shocking. And whereas Daniel is supposed to be a book really of revelation and what he says is going to happen in the future, it's very different if he wrote it 400 years after the events and said, oh, I predict Donald Trump will win. So it was amazing to see all the faults in the book and just how, at least in my view, dead to rights. It appears to be that this book is, in fact, a fraud, and that was even actually identified by some as early as the 3rd century AD. So I decided I knew we would always want to have on the author of that video. His name is Floyd F.E., and he has a lot of great videos. We have a link to his channel in the description. Yes, by the way, it is early. I know this is not a common hour for our audience, I'm aware, but I think it's going to be well worth it. And it's going to be a bit of a longer show. Daniel is older than Titan, but not by much. But at any rate, the link to Floyd's channel is in the description. He has been in the Great Debate YouTube community for many years and has focused primarily on counter-Christian apologetics. So we are, of course, very glad to have him here. So without further ado, let me bring out Floyd F.P. Floyd, how are you?
Good, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Floyd, what got you interested in the book of Daniel?
Yeah, I came across the book of Daniel. Boy, it had to be over 30 years ago. Uh, Back before the internet existed, there were two separate networks. One was BitNet, and the other one was ARPANET. And basically, they weren't available to the general public, but they were available at universities and colleges. So I happened to be working for a college, so I had access to both. And they had forums there, and I was on a Christian apologetics forum. So I've been at this for quite a long time. And someone brought. I was debating a Christian on the forum, and a Christian brought up, "Oh, what about the 70 weeks prophecy in the book of Daniel? That clearly prophesizes that Jesus would be crucified." And I looked at it, and sure enough, we have an Old Testament document that says the Messiah would be killed. Cut off is the exact term it uses. But and supposedly this book was written in the 6th century BCE. So if that's the case, then we have a real prophecy here. We have a book that was written in the 6th century BCE that prophesies that Jesus would be crucified. And they go so far as it even predicts the exact year that Jesus would be crucified. And if that's the case, boy, that's something special. That's something unique with the Bible. So, I was really surprised, but I was skeptical. I said, well, if that's really the case, I think many more people would be Christian, particularly,
Yeah.
Particularly a lot of the Bible scholars that are pretty, that aren't fundamentalists, so forth. So, fortunately, I was working at a college, so I was able to go to the college library and read some commentaries and books on it. And sure enough, it didn't turn out the way the Christian presented it to me.
Well, I've certainly heard it that way, and I've engaged in a few debates where it's been brought up that way. And in fact, I've used some of the material I learned from watching your video on it to help in those debates. But certainly at first glance, it certainly does appear to, even within the correct year, and there are more than one fallacies associated with this, but at least at first glance, it certainly appears to accurately predict Jesus's arrival and departure. And it seems to it coincides with elements of Matthew, or Matthew, I should say, perhaps coincides with the book, because of course Matthew knew that the book was written. And so it in terms of the Old Testament is one of the more important books that underpins Christianity. I mean, to the Old Testament is just sort of one of the regular. It's just another book in the Old Testament. But to Christians, this is an extraordinarily important book, is it not?
Yeah, especially for evangelicals. Evangelicals like to consider the Book of Daniel as a prime example of biblical prophecy coming true, and not only just biblical prophecy, but prophecy about Jesus, and also they go Christians go as far as to believe that Daniel prophesied about the Roman Empire, in which Jesus was crucified. And other evangelical Christians go as far as Daniel predicting our times and the future times to come as well. But they consider it
All right, let me interrupt. The quality of your mic seems to have dropped precipitously, and I'm not sure if that's on your end or our end. But
okay, let me check my settings.
It's better. You may have been far enough away from it that the noise gate wasn't fully.
Okay, I'll get closer to my mic.
That's much better. Thank you. So you were saying they go so far as to say that it predicted the Romans and it predicted the crucifixion of Jesus and.
Yeah, in fact, very early on, commentators, even Jewish commentators like Josephus, and later church fathers like Jerome, thought that Daniel was prophesying about the Roman Empire. Well, in fact, we actually have that in, like you mentioned, in the Matthew Gospel as well, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But yeah, some evangelical Christians today believe that Daniel even prophesizes about today's events and the future events to come. Particularly because at the end of Daniel, we have basically the resurrection of the dead. And since that didn't happen yet, they believe that not everything that is prophesied about Daniel has come true yet, because simply we haven't reached the end of the age yet. So if the end of the age hasn't come yet, it must be coming in the future. So that's why they keep on looking at it They look at it as perhaps it's going to talk about the sign of the times of these times, as well as it's the future time to us as well.
All right. Well, so now you have some materials here. So what I'd like to do is let's bring out your presentation here, and it actually looks like, oh, you know why? I'm betting that. Let me see if I can get that window to open up. There we go. And so.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about Daniel.
All right. I'd like to give some brief background and context about the book of Daniel. I think it's good to start there so you can help to understand it. And I'm just going to start with a quick introduction to ancient Jewish history. So when around 1000 BCE, we had a united kingdom of Israel and Judah under King David, supposedly, that united the kingdom. So it was under David and Solomon, and the capital was Jerusalem, of course. Critical scholars actually don't believe that there was a strong united kingdom, that Israel was still kind of on their own. But the Bible kind of paints a golden time of unity between Israel and Judah, even though critical scholars think that really wasn't the case, where the northern kingdom of Israel was never too excited about their southern neighbor. Then in around 930 or 922 BCE, they split again. Basically, Solomon's son took over as king, and the northern king of Israel simply didn't like him. They didn't like the taxes he put on them and so forth. So they split. So there was a northern kingdom of Israel, and the last capital was Samaria, and they were conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 720 BCE. And then there was the southern kingdom of Judah, which lasted to 586 BCE. The last capital was Jerusalem, and they were conquered by the Babylonian Empire. And then at 568 BCE, that's when the Babylonian exile occurred. That's when Babylon conquered Judah, and they exiled many of the top noble Jews to Babylon. So from the Babylonian exile, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon initially subjugated Judah about 605 BCE, and then Jerusalem was besieged in about 579 BCE by Nebuchadnezzar. And then at that time, he removed the Jewish king Jehoiakim. I always have trouble saying this name, Jehoiakim or Yahuakim.
Right, and your mic is cutting out a bit again. I think you may. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
All right, great. And replace him with a puppet king, Zedekiah, to govern Judah. And then Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And that caused Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the city and the temple in the summer of 586 BC and deport a large section of the population to Babylon. Not all the Jews were deported to Babylon. Some of, I guess, the poor people, the farmers and so forth, they stayed behind, but they basically deported probably, the more noble and higher class Jews to Babylon. All right, so at that time, supposedly, is when the character of Daniel existed, and supposedly that's when he wrote the book of Daniel. So that's what I'm going to get into now. So the composition of Daniel, it's an Old Testament text that records the activities and visions of Daniel, who was a noble Jew taken into Babylonian captivity as a teenager in 605 BCE and becomes an advisor for the royal court of the Babylonians through the reigns of Nebuchadnezzar, Balthasar, Darius the Mede, and Cyrus, which is a span of 73 years. Chapters 1 through 6 of the book of Daniel are Aramaic folk tales that give incidents of how certain people who kept their faith were saved by God during the Babylonian exile. In these chapters, we have the well-known story of Daniel in the lion's den. He was thrown in the lion's den, and miraculously he was not harmed by them. And then in chapters 7 through 12, we have Hebrew revelations that gives the history of the rising powers of the Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, and a very accurate description of the history of the 2nd century BCE that describes very well the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. It then gives actual predictions about the downfall of Antiochus and Israel's triumph, which turned out to be inaccurate.
All right. Well, okay. So he gave, now ostensibly the what he's talking about, the early part of the 2nd century here, that would be prophecy, and then the second part would be prophecy. The first part was historically completely accurate, and the second part was less so. Is that
right? So Daniel becomes an advisor of the Babylonian court in supposedly the 6th century BCE, and then in the book of Daniel, Babylonia is conquered by the Medes, which actually isn't correct, and then the Persians by Cyrus, and then eventually Alexander the Great. According to the book itself, Daniel's I guess position, or perhaps his life, ends at the first reign of Cyrus of Persia. That's where kind of his reign, either he retires, or I guess most likely dies then. But that's what the book portrays. But the book of Daniel goes beyond the period of Cyrus of Persia and actually talks about the Greek period of Alexander the Great, and also after his death, after Alexander dies, his kingdom is broken up between his 4 generals, which forms their own separate provinces, which they cause havoc and so forth. One of which was a Seleucid empire, which Antiochus Epiphanes came to rule, and he heavily persecuted the Jews in the 2nd century BCE, which the book of Daniel describes quite accurately about. And then
and presumably now this would be after Daniel's death. So Daniel's now already died. But he's saying This is what. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so Daniel has visions and prophecies all the way, beyond Alexander the Great, but I'm going to get into more about where it's inaccurate and how it becomes more accurate. And then actually it reaches a point where the author actually makes a real prediction, which ends up to be false. And that actually helps scholars determine when this book was actually written, based on the history it describes. So a little bit about the literary genre of the book of Daniel. It's considered apocalyptic writing. This form of writing is to address the great suffering that people are facing, to assure them that it will soon come to an end and their enemies will be destroyed. It encourages the people to remain faithful, since God will soon intervene. It's a subset of prophetic writings. And it contains an eschatology. What eschatology means is a revelation concerning the end of the present age. So it's eschatology is how a certain group of people or religion predicts the end of the world, or the end of this age, or or a new age to come. Characteristics of an apocalyptic writings are: the present age is ruled by evil powers. The age to come will be ruled by God. The end of the present age will happen in the very near future, and the transition will occur very quickly. And it's a very important point to remember about an apocalyptic writing, that it's not meant for some future date, but rather, at the time it was written, it's going to end soon. We're the people of God are under persecution. There's a great evil power that's ruling over us, but God's going to soon intervene and put an end to it all. And it's going to happen very abruptly and very empirically. It'll be very obvious. The transition will include wars, plagues, famines, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. And it can include a general resurrection of the dead, which the eschatology of Daniel does include. And sometimes a final judgment where the dead will be judged. And supporters of evil will be annihilated, and God's supporters will enter a period of peace and happiness. So other examples of apocalyptic writings we find in Judaism and Christianity is in the Old Testament. Examples are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Micah. There's also in the Apocrypha, we have Enoch and the War Scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the New Testament, we have the book of Revelation. In the Gospels, we have the little apocalypse in Matthew 24 through 25, and also we see apocalyptic themes in the Pauline and pastoral epistles. Other Christian examples include the ascension of Isaiah, the apocalypse of Peter, the apocalypse of Paul, the apocalypse of Thomas, and the Christian Sabellines. All right. And as you mentioned, Nick, in the Gospels, Jesus actually references the book of Daniel. It's very clear in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew 24:15, we read, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoke by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And Matthew borrows that from Mark 13, where Mark doesn't actually mention the prophet Daniel, but Matthew adds in, takes the very verse, but adds in spoken by the prophet of Daniel. This kind of shows kind of like this in source criticism of the Gospels in the New Testament, where one Gospel author actually uses another Gospel as its source.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine Jesus saying, "Let the reader understand."
Yeah.
Yeah. So here, the desolating sacrilege is often interpreted in the Gospels as the destruction of Rome. Destruction of Jerusalem and Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE by Rome. But I think in the original context, it was not about that at all. And I'll go into that a little later.
Yep.
The Gospels use similar themes as found in the book of Daniel. For example, in Daniel 7:13, it says, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him." That's similar to Matthew 24:30, which says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." You can see the author of Matthew was heavily influenced by the book of by the book of Daniel. And again, in Matthew, we actually have a general resurrection. In Matthew 27:52-53, it says, after Jesus was crucified and dies on the cross, it says the tombs were opened up, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And that kind of matches Daniel 12, which is the last chapter of Daniel in the Protestant canon. Daniel 12:2-3, it says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So here, the book of Daniel prophesies, the general resurrection, and we actually have that in the Matthew Gospel. It's quite remarkable. Too bad no other historian or no other gospel mentions this general resurrection. Only Matthew does.
Well, yeah,
Right.
and again, it seems to be that he's really just so. It doesn't seem like he's separately confirming what was in Daniel, but rather that he's actually borrowing heavily from Daniel and saying, well, this is what Daniel has and he's almost taking it for his own. Is what it appears like.
Yeah, the gospel writers, they kind of created the gospel narratives by referring to the Old Testament. They thought that the Old Testament prophesies about Jesus was all about Jesus. So when they come across different themes and so forth, they actually use that to create the gospel narrative. Not only the Christians in the first century and second century, but also other Jewish communities like the Qumran community, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from, practice what's called Pesher exegesis. That's where they reinterpreted Old Testament verses and recontextualized it, gave it new life and new meaning for their own period of time. So they thought the Bible was a living document, not an old relic. So when they read it, they read it as they were the audience rather than the original audience. So they interpreted it as something that was about their own time. So I'm going to turn on a light here to make myself a little brighter. Hopefully that'll help. There we go. So I can talk a little bit more of that. If we have time in the end, I can talk more about the prophecy, New Testament prophecy, and how they interpreted the Old Testament.
And let me remind you guys that, and in fact, actually, I'll bring the. I just realized I didn't have the integration in, so questions that they're asking, we'll put up on the screen. But you can always at me, and if you at me, I'll see it, and we can ask a question. Also, Floyd has graciously agreed to join us on the Discord after the show, and he will be answering questions then. So if you want to talk to him and ask him the questions yourself, we'll be doing. This stream is scheduled to be about 2 hours, and then we'll both be on Discord afterwards to hang out and chat. So, yeah, let me get I'll get some of the questions up, and please continue.
Okay, So let's talk about the authorship of the Book of Daniel. Conservative scholars believe that Daniel himself wrote the text in the 6th century BCE. And why do I think that? Well, because that's what the book says. For example, I'm not going to read all these verses, but Daniel 7 says he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. And then we have Daniel referred in the first person. It says, then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. And, Daniel 9:2 says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed, and so forth. I, Daniel. So the book says that, Daniel wrote it. So conservative Christian says, well, the Bible's the Word of God. God cannot lie. Daniel says I, so Daniel had to have written it. The author also refers Daniel in the third person as well, though. So, for example, in Daniel 1:6, it says, now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel. Verses later, but Daniel made up his mind and he would not defile himself. Then Daniel replied with discretion and so forth. So, kind of odd for Daniel to talk about himself in the third person, but I guess some people do that. If you remember the old politician Bob Dole.
I was literally going to say, I was going to say Bob Dole likes to do that. Nick Suter does that on occasion too. But so I mean, I completely get it. Nick's an odd duck. So, that does seem a little out of place, admittedly.
Yeah, but also Nebuchadnezzar is presented the same way in the book, where Nebuchadnezzar is presented in the first person and in the third person as well. So it's kind of suspect of whether or not Daniel wrote all of it, if any of it. So what do non-conservative?
Let me actually just also, and it's the changing of the voice. I mean, Bob Dole, he did that famously, and he got mocked for it. It was always a little weird, but it's like you knew you were listening to Bob Dole because he would do that. And it's to have a written text, and it's written so it's not extemporaneous, and to have that change, and to have there isn't a continuity there, strikes me as particularly odd. But sorry, please continue.
Yeah. So non-conservative scholars believe it was actually written during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes during the 2nd century. The result of this persecution was the Maccabean revolt that led to Israel's brief independence, and Daniel chapters 7 through 12 deals with this period. They believe that Daniel is a fictional character, and the book has anonymous writers, and it's considered a pseudepigrapha, which is simply the false ascription of a piece of writing to an author. So critical, liberal, and non-conservative scholars don't believe that Daniel existed at all, or wrote the book at all. And I'm going to go into reasons why they think that. The languages of Daniel, we actually have 3 languages that make up the full book of Daniel. If you include what's called the Apocrypha, or the non-canonical chapters of Daniel, which are included, by the way, in the Catholic and Ethiopian Orthodox canon. But anyway, from Daniel 1:1 to 2:4a, it's written in Hebrew. And then at 2:4b to 7:28, it changes to Aramaic. And then in chapter 8 through 12, it switches back to Hebrew. And then we have additions which are purely that we only have in Greek. So we have the prayer of Azariah, and the song of the 3 holy children. And we also have Daniel 13 and 14, where we have the history of Susanna and the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. And those are interesting stories. So if you don't know about those stories, and you're familiar with the book of Daniel, I'm sure most people are familiar with Daniel and the lion's den. You might want to check out these stories as well.
So, and I want to point out, I mean, one of the things that's important about this is if you're writing a book for posterity, or, you know, or writing a verse, a chapter, whatever for posterity, in general, you try to stick to one language. And the reason is because the more languages you have, the harder it is to find an audience that can read all of them and understand what, and now translating it's one thing if you decide that you're going to, but, so this was actually written ostensibly in as many as 3 languages if you include the sort of addition as part of the, which some branches of Christianity do, some don't, as I understand it, but at a minimum, and so at the sort of the it looks like ostensibly 3 languages for this if you include the whole thing, not three translations, but written in 3 languages. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's some evidence here, some suggestion that this book was kind of compiled over a period of time, that it was kind of added to over the decades, if not centuries. So it's not conclusive, but it is kind of evidence to help lead critical scholars to believe that this is not what the book appears to present itself to be. So because of that, let's look at the dating of when scholars think this book was really written. So conservative scholars claim it was written in the 6th century BCE, as the text infers. So it says that's when Daniel lived, so that's when it had to have been written. Most Old Testament scholars believe it was written during the Maccabean revolt against the Greek occupying forces in 168 to 164 BCE. Now, I'm going to get more into detail about specifics of that. The first major critic of its genuineness was Porphyry of Tyre, a Greek philosopher of the 3rd century CE who claimed that the Book of Daniel had been written by a person living in the 2nd century BCE during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. And most scholars believe that he was absolutely right. And this position stands to today.
Okay, so this guy, 3rd century, made a claim as to the authenticity, and so far, this is the position that seems to, at this point, have the most support and most evidence behind it. That no, it wasn't 6th century, but closer to sometime middle 2nd century.
Right. So it's not a 6th century book prophesizing about the 2nd century, but rather it's a 2nd century book, really just reporting on the history of the time and giving backstory, very incorrect history of the 6th century.
Well, and perhaps as you had pointed out too, to maybe give hope and to sit there and say, okay, here's what's going to happen in the near future. But if you're getting that from a prophet who several hundred years ago predicted everything till now and says, hey, guess what's happening in a couple of months, folks, that's a very different thing than somebody who's sitting down right now saying this is what's going to happen. So giving himself or the authors themselves authenticity by saying, oh, this was really written 600 years ago when it, or well, actually that would be 400 years ago, when really it was written for those people at that time.
Right. So if you're a Jew living in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BCE who's being persecuted by Antiochus Epiphanes, and you come across this book which actually predicts everything that's happening right before your eyes, and reassures you that this is going to come to an end. This can give the people great hope and faith that this is all part of God's plan, and it will soon come to an end. So you can see, I'll actually talk more about this, but you can see how this book was very important to those people at the time, and then actually becomes important to the Jews and Christians of the 1st century who were being persecuted by Rome in the 60s and 70s CE. So again, other people will read it and it'll apply it to their situation as well. So Okay, so why do most scholars think that this book was actually written in the second century in BCE and not the sixth century? So, just to give you an example of the scholars who actually believe that, these are not atheist scholars. These are not radical fringe scholars, but these are very mainstream scholars that believe that this is actually a second century work. For example, the New Oxford Annotated Bible notes that the author of Daniel was a pious Jew living under the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, 167 to 164 BC. The New Jerusalem Bible states that the book was written during the persecution of the Jews by the Syrian king. Actually, he's not Syrian, is Seleucid or Greek. Antiochus Epiphanes, 167 and 164 BC. His attempts to seduce the Jews from the observance of the law form the background of its message. And that helps us make sense of the book itself. And then finally, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops commentary states that the book takes its name from the author, who is actually unknown, but from its hero, who was allegedly among the first Jews deported to Babylon, where he lived at least until 538 BC. This work was composed during the bitter persecution carried on by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, 167 and 164 BC, and was written to strengthen and comfort the Jewish people in their ordeal. So here we have the Catholic Church itself acknowledging that the book of Daniel was actually written in the second century BCE.
All right, so it's not just, so it looks like, and I noticed you had made that distinction, and so I want to highlight that, which is you had said conservatives think that it wasn't, and then you put everybody else in the non-conservative. So it's not just liberals, it's not just atheists, it's not just religious or non-religious. It's people who don't have a what seems to be an ever increasing sort of hardline conservative view on it, especially in light of the evidence. But basically, anybody who isn't in the conservative camp on the interpretation seems to, at this point, and that includes Catholic scholars who are sitting there saying, no, this really isn't what it purports to be.
Yeah. So again, the consensus of critical scholars believe that, this is a second century work and not a sixth century work. And the conservative scholars who believe that, that Daniel actually wrote it in the sixth century is the minority view for sure. All right. So what are some of the reasons why they think it's a second century invention? So John Collins, his commentary of Daniel, states that the Aramaic in Daniel is of a later form that was used in the Samaria correspondence, but slightly earlier than the form used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning that the Aramaic chapters 2 through 6 may have been written earlier in the Hellenistic period than the rest of the book, with the vision of chapter 7 being the only Aramaic portion dated to the time of Antiochus. The Hebrew portion is, for all intents and purposes, identical to that found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting a second century BC date for the Hebrew chapters 1, 8, and 12. So in other words, they did a linguistic analysis of the language, and they found the Aramaic folk tales such as Daniel and the Lion's Den and so forth was slightly older than the second century. So they could have been borrowed folk tales that were written down, but the actual predictions found in chapter 7 and 8, which is in Hebrew, matches the time period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which began at the second century BCE. So that's one form of evidence that we have that was written later.
Yeah. So you had said language, so it's and I think we're going to probably get into this here, which is that it's how what they say and how they say it. So the sort of use of the words, but also what they're referring to. So the story, which actually was not as old as the 6th century, so presumably couldn't.
Right. So yeah, the way scholars look at the language is, a good example is, what if you think you're writing you're reading a work of Shakespeare, and it, and the text says, how art thou? What's up, dude? That would give a giveaway that Shakespeare really didn't write that. So that's kind of like a extreme example of what they look for, but it's something of that nature, something of a different anachronistic that isn't from the period. Here are other clues in the Hebrew Bible. Daniel is not included among the prophets. This exclusion indicates that both the book and its author were unknown as recently as the 2nd century, when the prophetic canon was fixed for the Jews. There's no reference to the book. Go ahead.
Okay, so there is a canon. It's a formalized canon of Jewish prophets, and I want to say it's actually 38 prophets, if I recall, but it's it's 48. 48 prophets, 7 prophets says. Oh my, the female prophet, prophesetes. And Daniel is not on that list, and that list was codified in early 2nd century. So the question is, if he's so good, and if this has been around, and if he's really this, again, so important. That Christianity didn't exist at this point, but he was important enough to anchor all of Christianity, and he's not a Jewish prophet, at least not by canon. Is that roughly what we're talking about?
Yeah, there's basically 3 categories of the Hebrew Bible. There's the law, or the Torah, also known about, also called the laws, the books of Moses, Pentateuch. There's the prophets, and then there's the writings. And in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is found among the writings rather than prophets. Where in the Christian canon, Daniel is considered a prophet.
You're cutting out again. I think your distance from your mic.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Perfect. Thank you.
But moving on, there's no reference to the book of Daniel before the 2nd century BCE. There's no mention of Daniel the person, nor his Babylonian name, Belshazzar, in any Babylonian records, and we have quite a bit. We have a good extensive record from Babylon during the period. The theology is too advanced for the 6th century BCE. Chapter 12 discusses the dead being judged and taken into either heaven and hell. The concept of heaven and hell was introduced later by the Greeks. Before that, we just had Sheol, the Hebrew Sheol, where the dead reside.
So the Greeks invade in about the 4th century, right? And then when they came, they brought with them changes in the language, because of course that was a major upheaval. New devices, fancy things, instruments, whatever they're going to bring with them, and of course new theological concepts. So hell did not exist as in the Jewish concept until after their arrival in the 4th century. Is that right?
Yeah, as a form of punishment, as a form of fiery damnation. There was Sheol, which pretty much every human went to. It's kind of like a gloomy afterlife, but nothing where people would be resurrected. Some going to heaven, and some facing everlasting contempt in hell. And then in Daniel 11:31, it refers to the abominable thing that causes desolation. This appears to refer to the erection of the statue of Zeus in the Jerusalem temple in in 167 BCE, would indicate that the book was written later than that date. About 180 BCE, Yeshua ben Sira listed the heroes of the Jewish faith, including Enoch, Noah, and Abraham, through to Nehemiah. Daniel is not mentioned. The earliest indisputable reference to the book of Daniel occurs in the book of First Maccabees, 260, dated to approximately 100 BCE. The earliest known manuscript copy of a fragment of Daniel is 4Q Dan from Qumran, also dated to approximately 125 to 100 BC. That's the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here's probably the most important factor in dating Daniel. The historical accuracy is poor when the book describes events starting in the 6th century BCE, when the author supposedly lived and would have known intimately as a high-ranking official of the kingdom. Strongest around the events of 164 BCE during the reign of Antiochus for Epiphanes, and then becomes inaccurate. So that's probably the biggest factor of how we can date Daniel. Pretty much between 167 and 164. So here's a chart just to illustrate that. So, supposedly Daniel lived in the 6th century, and he was a high-ranking official of the reigning empires at the time. So he was in the position to know the history of the time, but yet the history he gives, late back in the 6th century and a little later, is very inaccurate. But as we get closer and closer to 164 BCE, the details of the history he's giving becomes more and more accurate. And then right at 164, he gives a prediction which is flat out wrong. So that is when scholars think that the book was actually written sometime right before 164 BCE.
And of course, with any claim, one thing that you want to do is say, okay, if the claim was true, what would we expect? And if the claim was false, what would we expect? Now, if he had really written this in 600 BCE, and if he was really a prophet, we would expect a reasonably consistent, I would assume, accuracy throughout and it's hard to, this is an assumption because we don't have any confirmed prophets where we can sit there and use in part of our Bayesian analysis, have a prior, but we'd expect certainly also the most accuracy at a minimum around 600 BCE, and instead, now if it wasn't genuine, we would expect around the point where it was made, the highest level of accuracy dropping off further and further back and ending pretty precipitously after the writing itself. Is that fair to say? Do you think?
Right, and I mean, if he actually lived in that period, he doesn't even need to be a prophet. Supposedly, he was a high-level official for the empires reigning from the Babylonian period to the Medes to the Persians to the first year, of Cyrus of Persia's reign. So, he was a high-level official through all those empires. So. He wouldn't need special revelation from God to know these things. He actually would know it firsthand as a high-level official of these empires. So that information you think would be very accurate, but it turns out not to be. And where he's most accurate would be the actual predictions and prophecies that supposedly he wrote down in the 2nd century BCE. So these are all red flags to the historians of when this was actually written. So let's look at some of the inaccuracies that I mentioned. I'm not going to list them all. We'd be here quite a long time going into detail about them. But the first one is a major one is there's no record of the existence of Darius the Mede, who supposedly conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylonia in 539 BCE. chapter 9 refers to Darius as the son of Ahasuerus. Hopefully, I'm saying that. Scholars consider that to be Xerxes. Xerxes was Cyrus's great grandson and ruled from 485 to 465 BCE. His son was not Darius, but Artaxerxes the first. Xerxes' father was Darius first, but Darius was a Persian and not a Mede. Because of this problem, scholars have tried to find who in history could actually be Darius. I mean, suggested aliases for Darius has been Darius the Great, Cyrus's son Cambius, Cyaxares II, and Ugaru or Gubaru, Aster Keys, if I'm saying that right, etc. So they're trying to find, Darius and me must be someone. It could be these other people, but this is all conjecture, and nothing really clearly fits. So that's why most scholars think this Darius and Mede never existed. It could be a case where that the author may have confused Darius the Great of Persia, because with Isaiah 13, as well as Jeremiah 51, it claims that the Medes would destroy Babylon. So here you have the author referring to Old Testament texts for his history. So we read in Isaiah 13, for example, that the Medes would conquer Babylon. So Darius had to be a Mede. We had to have a Mede conquering Babylon. So the author of Daniel wrote about this Darius the Mede because why? Because Isaiah and Jeremiah claims that they would be a Mede, but unfortunately in history it's not. It was Persia. Persia actually conquered Media before they came into Jerusalem. So Mede was really not in the picture here. Daniel confuses Nebuchadnezzar with Nebuchadnezzar with his madness and living among the wild animals. It also claims of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Balthasar. He was not Nebuchadnezzar's son, but he was a son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was not a king. He was a co-regent under his father Nebuchadnezzar. He was not killed the night when the kingdom fell. His kingdom was not taken by Darius the Mede, but by Cyrus of Persia. Balthasar was not in Babylonia at the time, but rather Nebuchadnezzar was ruling Babylonia and was captured by Cyrus when he took the territory with no resistance. Nebuchadnezzar was returned to Babylon with his 13th regnal year, in which Balthasar was not present and no longer serving as co-regent. Cyrus treated Nebuchadnezzar well after Babylon fell in 539 BCE, so it was hard to imagine Balthasar would be killed. Apologists will say, perhaps Balthasar was not Nebuchadnezzar's son, but perhaps he was just his grandson, and that he was married. He married a relative of Nebuchadnezzar, so it's not to be taken literally. But again, that's just conjecture. All right, so here's a chart I tried to put together, comparing Daniel's history to the known historical record that we have from historians from the period, as well as the cuneiform tablets. We have quite a bit from the time. So Daniel's reign begins with Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel, it says the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, which would be 606 BC. And then from there, from Nebuchadnezzar, King Balthasar takes over, then followed by Darius the Mede, and then finally Cyrus, where in known history we have Nebuchadnezzar, which matches up. Although Nebuchadnezzar doesn't doesn't take power until 605 BCE, so it's kind of a year off, and he actually wouldn't have gone into Jerusalem until around 604, so it's a little off there. Then following Nebuchadnezzar, we have three other Babylonian kings reigning, and then we finally have Nabonidus. Sorry, always have trouble with names.
I don't know why you can't pronounce that one. That's just, oh dear Lord. I would pronounce it and show you how, but I don't want to embarrass you on our street. So Nabonidus.
But his son was a co-regent. Nabonidus was off, so he made his son co-regent at the time, and he had limited power, where Daniel called him king. And then after Nabonidus, Persia conquers Babylon, which is Cyrus. So that actually matches up. And then four rulers later, we finally get to Darius the Great, which he's a Persian, and he reigned in 522 to 486 BC, compared to Darius the Mede, who would have ruled before 539. So this is as a kind of summary chart of how what Daniel is reporting is different from the historical record that we have. So, move on. So what does Daniel actually get correct? Well, he's most accurate basically around chapters 9 through 11. So in Daniel chapters 10 through 12, it describes the events leading up to the reign in Acts of Antiochus IV Epiphanes up to 165 BCE. Daniel 11 describes the division of the Greek Empire into 4 parts, which is correct. Daniel 11, 5 through 20 describes the kingdoms of the north and south, known as the Seleucid and Ptolemy empires. Daniel 11, 21 through 35 describes the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who reigned from 175 to 164 BC. And then at verse 1140, the author really attempts to predict the future. He prophesies the king of the south of the Ptolemaic dynasty will attack the Greeks in Judea under Antiochus. The Greeks will win and will lay spoil to all of northeast Africa and return to Judea, where Antiochus will die. The end of history will then occur, but none of these events actually happened. Antiochus fell ill in Persia and died in 164 BC. He was busy in Persia looting the temples there, looting the temple treasuries for himself, and that's where he fell ill. And this is recorded in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So just to reiterate, so Daniel predicts that Antiochus will go into Judea, where he's destroyed by God or by the Jewish people. And that would bring about the end of the age. The end of the age would bring in the godly kingdom, in a time of peace and prosperity, and also the general resurrection would occur. But obviously none of that happened. So obviously that's going to lead to apologists and conservators to have to reinterpret that to mean something else. So in chapter 12, at that time, after Antiochus dies, the angel Michael, the great captain, will come from heaven as the resurrection of the dead takes place, and the good and evil are judged. So this is the last week of the 490 years in the 70 years prophecy that we find in chapter 9. If we have time, I'll get into chapter 9, the 70 years prophecy. If we have time, we're past an hour already, so I doubt I will. But on my channel, I actually give a 2-hour presentation focused mainly on chapter 9 and the 70 weeks prophecy. So if you want to learn more about that, I suggest you go to my YouTube channel and watch that video.
And let me interrupt real quick. So it's fine if we run a little bit over. I do think that is something that prophecy is worth understanding. I think it's worth knowing. I would very much like to cover it, but it's worth doing also in about 2 hours. So I think we're probably not going to touch on it right now, but that's not because it's not but the 70 the 70 weeks or the oh my God, 70 years of weeks, and oh dear Lord, I don't even remember. Yeah. It gets confused. It takes a lot of time, but go see that video. I think it's a worthwhile video. But it's
the 70 weeks of years, which is interpreted as 490 years. I go into excruciating detail over that prophecy and my other video on Daniel on my YouTube channel. And if we have time, I'll cover specific things. Perhaps I didn't mention in that video, but time permitting, we'll see. So again, we have the general resurrection of the dead in chapter 12, and you can see the Gospel of Matthew refers to that. So again, back to Matthew 27, the tombs were opened, and many bodies and the saints that were fallen asleep were raised, coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, and they went into the holy city and appeared to the many. So the author of Matthew actually has the end times occurring when Jesus is crucified. And actually, and that same apocalyptic theme is found in the Pauline epistles. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15:20 and 23, we read, "But in fact that Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who had fallen asleep. But each his own. Christ, the first fruits, then his coming, those who belong to Christ." So here, the Christians of the first century, including Paul, thought they were in the end times, and that since Christ was raised, he was the first fruit of the resurrection. Just like during harvest time, when the first apple falls from the tree, the rest of the apples will soon follow. So they thought they were in the end times, and the general resurrection was just around the corner. And in the Gospel of Matthew, the author actually has the saints resurrected. Too bad that's not recorded anywhere else in any gospel or history.
Now, and just as a clarification, in Matthew, it's probably slightly off topic, but did that happen after the resurrection, or was it? I've forgotten whether it was like a sign of so it happened, and then Jesus was the. As I recall, it happened after the crucifixion, but before the resurrection. Is that accurate?
Right. That's very interesting. You can see a lot of theological play here. So what happens is Jesus dies on the cross.
Yeah.
Then the tombs rise up. So the tombs rise up immediately after Jesus dies, which would be the Friday. Mm-hmm. But then Jesus is resurrected on Sunday, and then after he's resurrected, that's when the saints are resurrected, and then enter Jerusalem. Why is that? Because I think it's obviously for theological reasons. Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection, right? So Jesus had to be the first one to be resurrected. So it's a very awkward scene where Jesus dies, these tombs pop up, but they stay there for 3 days in the tombs dead, and then Sunday morning Jesus is resurrected, and then they're resurrected, and then enter. But you can see there's a lot of theological play here.
And that was, I think, was that to reconcile differences between Daniel and Matthew?
Well, no, I don't think it was to reconcile with Daniel. I think it's to reconcile with Christian theology. Jesus has to be the first fruit of the resurrection, right?
Yeah, but in Daniel, what's the order?
Oh, in Daniel. Antiochus is defeated. That's the last of the 4 kingdoms, and then there's a general resurrection, just not of the saints, but everyone, all dead is resurrected, and then each person is judged, some to everlasting glory, and some to damnation. But in Matthew, only the saints are resurrection. The sinners aren't resurrected, only the saints. So there is a difference there between Matthew and Daniel. But I think the reason why Matthew has the saints just stay in their tombs, although above ground, for 3 days is because theologically, Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection, according to Paul, for example. So Sunday morning, Jesus had to be resurrected, and then after Jesus' resurrection, then the saints could be resurrected.
All right,
but it's quite an awkward scene, and this story only appears in Matthew's Gospel.
Awkward, Jesus. Okay, you have all these graves popping up and the dead just hanging out there. I've been listen. I once showed up to class, an hour and 15-minute class. I showed up an hour late, and I didn't realize because I got the time wrong. That's awkward. I don't know what you call dead people rising from the. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications in the Old and New Testament and Christian theology. So I could go on for quite a long time, but for the sake of our time, I'll just keep on moving. Daniel asks again when the persecution of Antiochus will end, and a time of 1,290 days is given, which is 3.5 years, which is the last half of the last week of 70 in the 70 years prophecy in chapter 9. And then in Daniel 12, it says, and from the time that the continual burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So that's when Antiochus comes in, puts an end to the burnt offerings in the temple, and erects the statue of Zeus in there, desolating the temple. But then Daniel says, "Blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days." So it makes you think that 1,290 days passed, and then Daniel had to extend it to 1,335 days. So it's kind of like camping, whose first prediction failed. So he said, "Okay, I'll be 2 more months from now that'll happen." So this seems what's been going on here. So again, this helps us date the book, that this is happening sometime around 165, 164. That it's getting near the end here, and the 1290 passed, so it's extended to 1335. And also a note, in the chapter 9, Daniel doesn't mention any resurrection of the Messiah, or that the Messiah would return to judge. Wouldn't it have been nice if the chapter 9, 70 weeks prophecy, if it was actually about Jesus, would actually predict that Jesus would be resurrected on the 3rd day? But we don't get that at all. We have the Messiah was cut off, but not resurrected. In the 3rd day. Wouldn't that be a great detail to include if it was actually about Jesus?
Which cut off is interesting too, because it can mean so many things, and it's been interpreted. You could interpret it as when he's cut off from his followers. You could interpret it as when he's actually killed, so he's cut off from humanity. He's cut off. I mean, there can be so many ways, which is one way that I think you can get that prophecy to land just about where you want to, depending on how you define cut off. But I think cut off also was when the stay away from that for now. All right, so please continue.
Yeah. So here's who is this Antiochus for Epiphanes? This is what critical scholars think. This is what it's really about. This is the whole reason why this book of Daniel was written. It was because of the persecution that the Jewish people were experiencing at the time. He was a Greek king of the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC until his death in 164 BC. Epiphanes means God manifest. People called him Epimanes, which means the madman, a madman. He was a real brutal emperor. Daniel 11 describes his campaign against Egypt. He Hellenized Jerusalem, which led to the Maccabean revolt. Hellenized, what does that mean? Hellenized means that to adopt Greek culture. So Antiochus wanted to end Jerusalem society, Jerusalem religions, Jerusalem's culture as a whole. He wanted them to adopt Greek culture. That's what Hellenized means, and that's why he was, so hated. The Hellenized Jews, under his control, built a gymnasium within Jerusalem and encouraged Greek culture. In 168 BC, he stopped the resistance where the city was destroyed. Many Jews were killed, and a military citadel was built called the Acra. He defiled the temple, offered a pig on his altar, erected an altar to Zeus, prohibited temple worship, forbid circumcision, sold thousands of Jews into slavery, destroyed copies of Scripture, prohibited Jewish worship and customs such as Sabbath observances. So you can see, all the persecution that the Jewish people at the time were experiencing under him. If someone's an antichrist, would be considered an antichrist, this would be a good candidate for what he did. I'm not sure if it's in Josephus or in Maccabees. I'm drawing a blank, but there was a story of some Jewish mothers circumcised their newborn sons, and that's by custom. That's always done on the 8th day after birth, and the Seleucid army soldiers actually killed the babies and made the mothers wear the babies around their necks, to punish them.
Lord.
So you can see the brutality that was going on for practicing your Jewish faith. So it was a horrific period for them. First Maccabees describes Antiochus. I'll read it. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, tore down its houses and its surrounding walls, and they took captive the women and children and seized the cattle. Then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. And they stationed there a sinful people, lawless men. They strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collected the spoils of Jerusalem. They stored them there, and became a great snare. It became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel continually. And every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood, and they even defiled the sanctuary. And that reflects Daniel 11:31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the continual burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. That's the statue of Zeus that he erected within the Jerusalem temple. So, and Antiochus actually viewed himself as a manifestation of Zeus. He had a real, God narcissistic complex. Critical scholars identify him as the little horn in chapters 11 and 8 of Daniel. All right, so apologists will say, we brought up that this Daniel just came on the scene, in the 2nd century, that he wasn't really mentioned. But apologists will say, Daniel is actually mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, which is a much later book, and we find Ezekiel chapter 14 and 20. It says, even these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, and they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness, says the Lord God. And even Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, and I live, says the Lord God. They would deliver neither son nor daughter. They would deliver but their own lives, but their righteousness. So here they say, oh, here's Daniel here, mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. But consider, would Ezekiel list a contemporary of him? Because Ezekiel was writing of the time of the Babylonian exile. Would Ezekiel list a contemporary along with the ancient legendary heroes such as Noah and Job? And notice that it's even spelled differently. And also in Ezekiel 28:3, we have, you are indeed wiser than Daniel. No secret is hidden from you. So who is this Daniel? Well, in the New International Version footnote, it actually states, or Daniel, a man of renown in ancient literature. So who is this Daniel, this man of renown in ancient literature? Well, we actually have a Uritic tablet which tells the story of Daniel, who was a divine Canaanite hero known for his wisdom. So this is what some scholars think that Ezekiel is referring to, is this Canaanite hero rather than the Daniel that appears in the book of Daniel itself. The apologists will bring up Josephus, claiming that Alexander the Great was actually read the book of Daniel. So at the end of book 11 in the Jewish Antiquities, Josephus accounts a story of high priest Yedua showing Alexander the Great the book of Daniel in 332 BCE that prophesies about him. So if that's the case, if Alexander the Great actually read the book of Daniel, was presented the book of Daniel by the high priest in the 4th century, that would be a strong defeater for the critical scholars' claim that it was actually written in the 2nd century. So apologists will bring this up quite a bit. They say, hey, Josephus records that Alexander the Great knew about the book of Daniel. So booyah, critical scholars. What do critical scholars think about this? Well, we have to be careful with Josephus. Josephus wrote his Jewish Antiquities in around 90 CE, which is the 1st century CE. And we need to be careful when we read Josephus, and generally scholars think he's not very reliable in history in the past. I mean, he rewrites narratives about Moses and so forth, and he like many historians at the time, he was quite biased. So Antiquities is considered a apocalyptic work directed primarily to non-Jews, where at times omits or even changes biblical stories to put Jewish history in the best light for his Roman audience. Josephus scholar Louis Feldman noted that how Josephus would make modifications of biblical narrative because of his apologetic concerns to defend the Jews against the charges of their critics and portray Jewish heroes such as Moses to make them contemporary to pagan heroes. So again, Josephus was an apologist writing to his Roman audience, and he wanted to put Judaism and their heroes in the best light. Compared Moses to Zeus, for example, or Romulus, and so forth. Josephus is considered generally reliable about his own period in which he lived, but as we go back, Josephus becomes much less reliable as far as reporting. Dr. Dean R. Ulrich writes, he evidently tried to review Jewish history in such a way as not to upset his Roman patrons. Although Josephus could mention Roman conquest, he dare not say that biblical prophecy announced the eventual triumph of God's kingdom over all others. So, Josephus was basically a Roman slave, and if he didn't, patronized his Roman leaders well. He would be in trouble. And
Consequences,
Josephus was actually, Josephus was lucky to be alive. He was a general in the Jewish army that was captured. So he's lucky to be alive. Unfortunately, his troops didn't make out so well as he did. What does the actual story in the Iniquities chapter 11 actually state? I think we kind of need to look at the detail of why we think this story isn't.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. Do you think we can? How does 10 more minutes sound to you? About? Do you think we can get this in 10 minutes, or how much time are you going to? I'm going to try to schedule a few things here.
I could skip over some of the stuff. I don't think 10 minutes is enough for me to cover everything. Let me see. I can cut out some detail.
My bad. We booked 2 hours. I can go a bit more. I can probably stretch it past 10 minutes too. But I just want to.
Okay. Let me try to speed things up and try to finish in 15 minutes.
Oh, perfect. All right. I think that will work. So thank you.
Okay, so this is how the story goes, found in Josephus. Alexander demands the submission of the Jewish high priest Yadua, but Yadua refuses because he had given his oath to Darius III of Persia. Angered by this, Alexander prepares to march on Jerusalem, motivated by a dream from God that promised no ill consequences. Yadua went out with the priests and the multitude of the citizens to bravely greet Alexander outside of Jerusalem before he could invade it. Surprisingly, Alexander bows down before Yadua and reveals that Yadua appeared to him in a dream 3 years earlier and encouraged him to invade Persia. And then Alexander gives gifts to the Jewish people and actually goes into the temple to make an offer to Yahweh. So instead of Alexander conquering Jerusalem, Alexander actually practically, it literally bows down to the high priest and offers gifts and so forth. After rejoicing, Alexander enters the temple to make sacrifices to Yahweh and offers gifts to the Jews. So most scholars believe that this passage in Josephus is fiction. The Talmud offers a competing story where High Priest Simon the Just visits Alexander in Antipatris. So there's actually a competing story to this, which contradicts it. In the Association of Jewish Studies Review, Shaya J.D. Cohen writes, the aim of the story was to find a place for the Jews in Hellenistic history to show that the conqueror of the world considered Jerusalem worthy of its visit, and the Jews accepted Maccabean sovereignty. For sake of time, I'll move a little quicker. He concludes that the historical Alexander did not visit Jerusalem, did not do observances to the high priest, and did not sacrifice to the God of Israel. He was too busy conquering the world to bother with insignificant inland people living around a small temple. As tension between the Adventus and Epiphany stories demonstrate, it was not always easy to decide whether Alexander surrendered to the Jews or the Jews surrendered to Alexander. So scholars think, that this is a fictional story. Here in the Talmud, we have the conflicting story of Alexander going to the high priest Simon the Just instead. So if you have, for sake of time, I won't read it, but here's the conflicting story found in the Talmud itself. Daniel describes 4 kingdoms in chapters 2 and 7. in chapter 2, it talks about a 4-section statue of its head being gold, and then silver, brass, and then iron and clay. In chapter 7, it has the dreams of the 4 beasts, which represents the same kingdoms: a lion with eagle wings, a bear, a leopard, and a terrible beast with long iron teeth and 10 horns. And then in chapter 8, he has a vision of a male goat with a horn between its eyes that destroys a twin horned ram. And then following these 4 kingdoms brings the kingdom of God. God will defeat these kingdoms and set up an indestructible divine kingdom. And those are the verses that talk about that. And in this, that's when the one like the Son of Man will come, one of Ancient of Days. So how do we interpret these 4 kingdoms? What are the 4 kingdoms that Daniel's actually talking about? Well, the first one is pretty clear. Daniel makes it clear in Daniel 2. He says, "You, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold." So the first kingdom is Babylon. No one really disputes that. Both conservative and non-conservative scholars agree that it's clearly about Babylon, simply because Daniel makes it pretty clear. Then Daniel talks about the Babylonian kingdom is divided, given to the Medes and Persians. So he gives a clue. Okay, well, the following kingdoms are considered Medes and Persians. And then he mentions the Medes and Persians. And then he brings up in chapter 8 that the Medes and Persians fall by the king of Greece. Who is the king of Greece? Well, that's obviously Alexander the Great. So we have 4 kingdoms here: Babylon, Medes, Persians, and the Greece, which is Alexander the Great. Here's another 10:20, which mentions the prince of Persia, and then followed by the prince of Greece to come, which would be Alexander the Great. And again, in chapter 11, it mentions Persia and Greece. So what do critical scholars believe are the 4 kingdoms? Well, they believe it's first Babylon, then Mede, which is Darius the Mede, then Persia, which would be Cyrus, and then the terrible beast would be the Greek Empire, which would be Alexander the Great, in which the little horn, divided kingdom. The divided kingdom is when Alexander died and was split up to his 4 generals, and then later came the little horn, which would be Antiochus Epiphanes. So here, Alexander dies, and his kingdom is divided into 4, which Daniel mentions quite a few times. How are the 4 kingdoms interpreted? Again, the secular, critical, liberal scholars believe that the 4 kingdoms is Babylon, Media, Persia, and then Greece. Where conservative Christians in early traditional views, it was interpreted as Babylon, Medo-Persian combined, Greek, and then Rome. So where do they get Rome? I think they're simply applying their own period to the story. Nowhere in Daniel is Rome mentioned, and it seems pretty clear that the events he mentions Greece, and the events happening in 11 is clearly about Antiochus Epiphanes. So there's no mention of Rome at all. And of course, since the resurrection of the dead and the end of the age really didn't occur, there's future interpretations. For example, Hal Lindsey in The Late Great Planet Earth states that the 10 horns of Daniel 7:24 represents the 10 nation of the European economic community. So Norman Proteus' book, Daniel Commentary, he calls these interpretations the deplorable history of the interpretation of this book. So you have Christians today, reinterpreting Daniel to apply to our time, our modern time. Josephus himself believes that Daniel prophesies about the Roman Empire. In Antiquity 10, he writes, "Our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came true. In the same way, Daniel also wrote about the Roman Empire, and they would capture Jerusalem and destroy the temple." So Josephus himself applied Daniel to the first century Roman rule as well. And also, it's also reflected in the commentary of Daniel of the early church father Jerome. I won't, for the sake of time, I won't read it, but you can read Jerome's commentary and read this on your own time. All right, so that leads us to the 70 weeks. Again, I can spend another 2 hours just talking about that. And in fact, I did talk 2 hours about that in my previous presentation on Daniel, so I'll hold off on that. I can take any questions about the 70 weeks if you want to go into detail, and perhaps in the Discord show afterwards, I can talk more about the 70 weeks as well. But again, I'll quickly interpret the 70 weeks prophecy here, and then I guess then we can call it a show. So the 70 weeks prophecy is found in Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. It says, 70 weeks are decreed for your people and to your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy place. So what are the 70 weeks? That's 490 years. Know therefore, understand, from the time that the word came out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of the anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks. That anointed priest is Cyrus. And for 62 weeks shall be built again a street and moat, but troubled time. And then in verse 26, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the troops of the prince who came who is to come shall destroy the city and sanctuary, and shall come a flood, and to the end shall be war. Desolations are decreed. He shall make a strong covenant for many of 1 week, and the half a week he shall make a sacrifice and offering cease, and in a place shall an abomination of desolates, and until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. So in verse 26, some Christians think they're talking about Jesus being killed here, where critical scholars, liberal scholars, and so forth think it's high priest Onias III, who was killed in 171, which I believe as well. And I'll just pull up a chart that shows the differences. So here's the view for the 70 weeks. The common evangelical conservative view is, when is the word to restore Jerusalem? Well, it varies. Same with the secular view. The anointed priest, the anointed prince in verse 25 is considered to be Jesus, when critical scholars believe it was the ruling Persian or high priest at the time, which when Persia gave back Jerusalem to put it into the Babylonian exile, could be about Cyrus. Who's the one cut off? Well, even an evangelical view is that it was Jesus, where the critical secular view that it was high priest Onias III. The prince that destroys the city, typically that's considered the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE by Titus of the Roman Empire, or it could be some future Antichrist when the Jerusalem temple is rebuilt. And of course, the critical view is that Antiochus Epiphanes, the abomination of the desolates, Christians interpret that as the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, or some later event, where critical scholars believe it's the pagan altar of Zeus. And the last week of the 70 weeks, some evangelicals think that finishes with Stephen in Acts 7, when he was stoned. And then the critical secular view is that it's failed prophecy. It failed to materialize within the 40 years period. in the 2nd century BCE. So I will end my presentation there.
All right. Well, thank you, and I do apologize. So we're 2 hours and 45 minutes in, which is delightful because it means that there was a lot of really great material. But I'm going to need to get going. I will. So we talked about this earlier. We're going to be available in the Discord. So I'm going to at least need a few minutes. But I think Floyd knows his way to our Discord. We're going to be in the VC Lounge. So hopefully anybody here who wants to join us and has more questions for him, either on what we've been discussing, any part of Daniel, I'm sure he's we did not cover the 70 weeks prophecy, but I think it's a marvelous one to get into. And I think, in my view, the reality as we understand it versus the apologetics, which it's so rare that, there's always, people who engage in apologetics do a pretty decent job usually, and they've got a lot to work with. But it seems with Daniel that it's a losing battle, and there's so much there. For me in particular, the differences in the language, the lend words, the instruments that didn't exist at the time, and all this other stuff is just. But there's just so much. So. Thank you very much, Floyd, for sharing this with us. Now, where can people find you? We do have the links down at the bottom, but we've also got his Discord handle. We've got his Twitter handle, Facebook. All that is in the description. But Floyd, do you want to remind us where people can find you and what you do?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. You can email me at floydfp@gmail.com. I don't have a Discord server, but I do have a Discord handle, and I'm on various servers at different times. You can message me. You can talk on there. You can message me on Facebook. I do have a YouTube channel, so it'd be great if you can subscribe and watch some of my previous videos on there. And I have a lot of videos on biblical criticism, and as well as rebuttals to apologetics. I focus a lot on presuppositionalism. I tackle presuppositional apologetics, which is kind of trendy right now, and a lot of people like my debates with Darth Dawkins on there. So I have my debates with him on there. A lot of people like them, and my other debates I had on there. So go ahead and check it out, as well as that my other presentation on the book of Daniel, that I go into detail about the 70 weeks prophecy. So if you want to learn about that, you can watch that.
That's a great video. I've seen that video. I haven't seen the Darth Dawkins, and I had heard about him, but I didn't know really anything about him. And then I ended up just getting onto his Discord because a friend of mine was there, and then so I had my first encounter with him. But also the material on presuppositionalism is great, because I've seen that as well. So I highly recommend the channel. I hope you guys will go check that out. And in the meantime, so we do have coming next week. In the coming weeks, actually, we do have post-theism and Christian atheism, and we have that show up. If you want to see what that's about, you can link there. We're also going to be doing a stream with Christopher Mowdy and 604. We're going to be simulcasting. That will be coming up in a bit, as well as a discussion on Mr. Rogers, who I think is somebody, Fred Rogers, who I think is often not given enough credit for just the kind of human being he was and what it was that he accomplished, because it was a lot more than just having a children's show on PBS. He really did a lot to shape the culture and character of an entire nation. So we will be discussing Mr. Rogers next week on In Time. In the meantime, we will be. I will be in the Discord as soon as I can. I have a few obligations I got to attend to real quick, and then I'll hop into the Discord. Floyd will be in the Discord, I think, momentarily. So anybody who wants to ask him any questions, thank you all for joining us. And if you made it this far, that means I hope that you liked the stream. So if you could like and subscribe, hit that bell. That is just one marvelous way to help us out. It helps us with the analytics. It really does help. So that's why we shill it. And, it's just a great way to show your support and help make this content possible. any number of other ways to support. I won't get into it now. I won't bore you. Everybody wants to go talk to Floyd. So please join us on the Discord. The link's been dropped a few times. The link is also in the description. Thank you once again to Floyd, who went out of his way to make a great presentation for us, which I apologize that we kind of went through quickly at the end, but it was a great presentation. And thank you, Floyd, for spending that time with us. So, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you all in just a couple of minutes on the In Time Discord in the Lounge VC.
All right, thank you.